Is fit. Okay. Yeah, you're recording from now. So welcome again, everyone. My name is Hans Hasselt, and as Ms. Urgebrecht already mentioned, I'm a lecturer at Saxion University, but I also have my own business, which is called H2 Knowledge Transfer, and I will briefly introduce first myself. It's a while that I have used this program for online teaching, but it's nice to see that approximately 30 students were present. And let me see. Go to the next slide. Yeah, my presentation for today, we in collaboration with Untitled University, we have scheduled 3 lectures, and this is the first one. And there's one for next week, probably the same time, and one for the 15th of December. And today, I'd like to start, of course, with an introduction, a little bit about myself. And I have a Socrative, an online program, which I like to use for getting some feedback and some answers. But obviously, you can also use the chat. In the introduction, I will also briefly explain something about learning during online lectures, because I hope you can understand me clearly, can hear me clearly. But if things are not clear, just please raise your hand or interrupt with a chat. And I know Ms. Rugebrecht also pays attention to that and helps me in checking if everything is still fine and if I need to stop or if I need to elaborate on a certain thing. Because I'm going to talk about environmental impact assessment, AMDAL. I also like to make a brief comparison between Indonesia and the Netherlands. Second part is about the environmental impact assessment itself. I will explain more about the concept of environmental impact assessment and several other methods. I will show a few examples from around the world. This time I will mainly talk about Europe, and I will briefly go into the different steps in EIA, because that's the main subject more for next week. But I like you to introduce it briefly so you can already practice maybe in the time in between today and next week. Then I will explain a homework assignment, not very difficult, not a lot of work, but I just want you to consider a few things related to this assignment. It's a group assignment, so you can form groups, and we will discuss this later. And then in the end, there's time for questions, discussion, and evaluation. But like I already mentioned, if you want to interrupt because things are not clear, just please raise your hand, unmute your microphone, and we can have a discussion. If English is a problem, then it's not a problem that you speak in Bahasa Indonesia, and not because I'm able to understand that, but I'm quite sure that Ms. Rugebrecht will help me in finding a good translation. So let's start with the first part for today. And depending a little bit, I forgot to mention that there's probably also a break somewhere around after an hour. We'll see how it goes. Personal introduction. This is a picture that I took on Ambon about 10 years ago. And I'm founder of H2 Knowledge Transfer after working for over 30 years in education at the university in the Netherlands. I thought it was interesting also to practice a little bit more with online teaching. I had over 1,000 students from around the world, international students coming to Deventer, or I gave lectures elsewhere around the world, but I didn't want to increase my carbon dioxide footprint that much anymore. So in 2016, I started with H2 Knowledge Transfer, just because we can exchange information and I can teach online During COVID, in the last 2 years, I did a little bit less online teaching for international groups because I was teaching also my Dutch groups and became a little bit bored with only online teaching. But fortunately, we can teach again live in the university for the Dutch students, and I enjoy always teaching foreign groups. I'm a consultant for environmental impact assessment, and therefore I was also in Indonesia in 2010 and also visited other places. And I'm an ambassador for an organization called Yagwa Limpo Tabangkasan. It's an organization that helps people in Africa to build drinking water tanks for rainwater collection. So in the dry period, they have sufficient, families have sufficient amounts of water to survive. At Saxion, I'm working at the School of Governance, Law and Urban Development. I'm mainly working in urban development, and there I'm a senior lecturer in sustainable urban development and also a researcher in 21st century skills, mainly educational parts. My main objectives for today are, I think it's always interesting with this online teaching that you learn from different places around the world, that you can practice professional English, listening, reading, speaking, and perhaps also a little bit writing in the homework or maybe in the chat. And that you can learn from similarities and differences elsewhere in the world. And of course, there are also some specific objectives which I discussed with Ms. Rugebrecht. Learn about EIA, strategic environmental assessment and environmental and social impact assessment. And I like to do that with good practices and particularly also mistakes we've made. So you can easily learn from mistakes. It's not so easy to learn how you should improve mistakes, but at least you should not repeat mistakes. Now, to knowledge transfer, I started with this somewhere about 20 years ago when I was for the first time in South Africa and was still able to teach my students in the Netherlands. I teach every year courses on environmental health in Thailand. And this was another group in Indonesia, which that was in India about a couple of years ago. And I do not only teach foreign groups like you, but we try to also arrange collaboration projects between several groups from both universities, from Umpati and Saxion University. My company H2 Knowledge Transfer is committed to sustainable development. I hope you've heard about this subject before. And these are the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations. And I work on several ones, but I always like to include that whatever we do and whatever subject we teach, it is always, or it should, in my opinion, be always related to Sustainable Development Goals. And I do not much directly, of course, on one, poverty or hunger, but mainly, of course, on education, on life, on land, on climate action, on reduced inequalities, those kind of subjects. And mainly within Saxion also on affordable and clean energy. If you want to read more, you can find this Sustainable Development Report of 2020 on this link, and this file will be sent to you afterwards. I see that there are a few things already mentioned in the chat, but Ms. Rugebrecht should help me a little bit with that. Oh, that's her announcement. Thank you. This is the map of Indonesia and the surrounding area in Southeast Asia. I added some dots on places that I visited. So you can see that I've been several times on Bali and on Java and on Bali. Once on Sulawesi and also in Malaysia and Vietnam, a little bit in the north, and only one time on Maluku. and that was, I'll show you later a few pictures from me in I have to click away a few things and continue where we left. Sorry for this. Don't know even what happened. So this is me in Surabaya in 2010, teaching Indonesian students at ITS in Surabaya, and I hope to visit Surabaya again in 2022, so this coming year, to teach there for a couple of weeks. This is in Unpati, Ambon, in 2010 as well, on a separate visit. And this is the group from Unpati on Amdaal, and you clearly recognize, of course, Miss Rugebrecht. She didn't change much, and you also see that the Dutch lecturers on average are a little bit taller than most of the Indonesian colleagues. So I also like to have a little bit feedback on who are you, and therefore I have to switch to another screen, and I would like to show you this. For interaction, please go to besocrative.com and then choose login and then student login, and the room number is 76453. Maybe someone can repeat that in the chat. Login is not required. I'm going to start up now this program myself. Oh. I need to find this. Sorry, it takes a while. Start. So I hope it's visible at the moment. This is the introduction lecture, and the first one is just to check if everything works. And so the room number is, you have to go to b.socrative.com and then lecturer, student, login. And then I have 70 questions ready, but we do not do all of them during this afternoon session. I see hand of Gilbert. Gilbert.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, sir. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Is it possible for you?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, my network's not really good right here, so can you please say it louder? I can really hear you well.
Okay. Let me see if I can do something about that.
So based on your introduction lecture here, if you ask me how many years do I study at University of Guatemala, so my answer is between 1 and 2 years, because I'm in the 3rd semester now.
Okay, yeah, that's what I like to know, but I like students to enroll on the b.socrative.com website.
Oh, okay.
So if you go in a separate screen to Socrative.com, then you can click on login, and then you see two options, one for teachers, that's like me, and one for students, and that's like you at the moment. And then they ask, it asks a number, a room number, and that is 76453. That is the one. I can share that also in the video, or in the chat. Room number 76453. Oh, something not working in my desktop, laptop. 453. I can see students then enrolling, entering this introduction lecture and the first question. And at the moment, I see that only none of you have enrolled. So it might be a problem with doing that. And that's particularly, of course, I like to know a little bit about how many years you're already studying. But it's also for practicing if this program works, because I like to ask more feedback during some other parts of the presentation. What do you see at the screen, Gilbert, if I can ask you?
That's your introduction lecture here, sir. I can see it clearly.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Sir, may I ask you,
Yes.
sir?
Yes.
How can we open the website? We have to sign up.
Yeah, if you go to, for instance, Google and type Socrative.com, like it is here, then it starts. It comes up at the top. Of course, you can also type Socrative.com in the browser. And then a kind of commercial website opens in which you can enter, log in, and then it asks if you're a teacher or a student. And if you click on students, then it asks a room number, and the room number is like this 76453. And then you're supposed to end up in this online program for answering questions. But you're not the only one. I see that none of you is able to, then we do it in a different way. Let me see. Yeah. Thank you, Fancy. Let's see if this works, and otherwise we'll do it in a different way. Then I go back to the presentation and just ask a few of you.
So you mean that we have to go to the Be Socrative link, and then
Yes.
you have to click it. If you are a student, you have to click student, and if you are a teacher, you have to click teacher, and then you have to make your own account so we can interact with this link.
You don't have to make your account. You can do it only by clicking on students.
Okay.
So everyone is a student. You can be a student too for this.
Okay, okay.
And then it asks a room number.
Okay.
Maybe I should do it.
So untuk semuanya, Anda boleh ke Be Socrative yang Ibu sudah kirim di chat, lalu tinggal klik saja www.socrative.com, lalu Anda tinggal login, muncul student, Anda tinggal klik student, lalu isi room number 76453. Nanti ada interaktif di situ yang Hans bisa lakukan supaya kita bisa sama-sama.
This is what I see if I type in www.socrative.com, and then on the upper right part of the screen you have login, and then you can choose student login, and then you have to type here the room number, and the room number is like I already mentioned, 76453. I'm not going to do that at the moment because you cannot be enrolled as a lecturer and a student together. But this is how it works.
I'm work.
Okay.
It's working on me.
Yep.
So you can see.
I can see.
So I have to answer, for example.
Yeah, you have to answer the first question, and of course that's a bit silly one for you.
Okay.
Sir?
Yes.
I already answered the first question, but going to second question, it's a little bit down network here, so I can't really use my...
No, you have to wait till the others are ready.
Oh, I see. Thank you, sir.
I was kicked out myself because I opened it also as a student. So lounge quiz, no. I'm sorry, I have to do it over again, but then we can at least try once more. Teacher paste, yeah. I can see here, and I hope you can see also my screen, that 4 students answered.
Jadi tolong yang lain tolong diisi juga ya. Silakan Anda ke link di socrative.com lalu isi pertanyaan pertama. Berapa lama Anda sudah bersekolah atau sudah kuliah di Fakultas Hukum Unpati?
If everything works well, then you also see now again the introduction lecture with the question, the first question, and you see here in the middle that 2 students are at the moment, and only 5 had the first couple of you were enrolled while I exited the program, but I hope that will be better in the next question. This was a question that is of course interesting for me a little bit, but you know, you're the only one that really knows the answer. Most of you are studying in between 1 and 2 years, so probably in the 3rd semester. Okay, then I go back to, we can do the second question. What is your age? And then you can type in "23 is the first one. Thank you. I'm 19. Yeah. So thank you. This goes much faster now. We're learning. I do not click on the names. It's for me interesting what kind of names you used or you have, if you are honest. But the majority is somewhere around 19, a few a bit younger, a few a little bit older. There's 123. Thank you. And not everyone answered. There are 30 students at the moment. as you can see as well, and half of them answer the question. My youngest son is 19 years old, so I can imagine a little bit what it is like to be 19. My daughter, my only daughter, she's the oldest, she's 24 at the moment. So this is the kind of age that I used to teach also within at the Saxion University. Some students are 17 when they start, so they're usually 18 in the second or third year. Some are 19, and some are a little bit older until 27, 28, with a few exceptions. Not everyone answered, but for the time, I'm going to continue with the third question. What is your main professional or educational interest? And actually the question is like, why do you study the program you have selected? And maybe I could guess one of the answers. It is because I'm interested in law in general, or I'm more interested in law enforcement. You can read yourself all the answers. Maybe you want to do something to support local development, or maybe the national development, or you like to protect the weaker people, the less educated, the financially poor people, or people that are not well represented. And if you have another reason, of course, you can also select age. And if you don't know, or the answer is too complicated for you to read in English, you can also press I. Now, 6 students already answered. I'm very curious, of course. In total, we have now 49 students present. So welcome, everyone. Yeah, the majority is just interested at the moment in law in general. Some of you also selected, a large amount of students selected protection of the weaker. Other reasons, and 6% is probably one. Numbers are increasing, 19 students. Okay. I will leave this. If you're still reading, you can just finish, but I'll go back to my presentation because I have at least an idea of who is present today. Young people compared to me, and like around the age of 19, 20, most of you. People that have a general interest in law, of course, that's obvious if you study law. And most of you are in the second year. I go back to my previous presentation. This is the one we did. This is the one we did. And this is the third part, or the second part of the online learning event today. I'd like to give you some tips because there's a big difference between teaching offline and teaching online. With offline teaching, we have a lot of experience because you can see each other easily in the classroom. You can discuss things easily. I can better see people in the eye and see if they understand things clearly. And it may be much more easy, particularly if you speak the same language, to ask questions or to interrupt. With online lectures, students have to be also active, and that is a bit represented by this. You can lead the horse to the water, but you cannot make it drink. And so if drinking is important, then you should drink, and that means that you should be active, and that means that you should listen carefully. But if I say things that are not clear, please raise your hand, please ask, please interrupt, or type a question also in Bahasa in the chat. Learning is not only listening, you should also actively work with the new knowledge. And that means that first you have to listen and understand it, but also ask questions, not only to me, but perhaps also to you. And does it make sense to you what I tell you? What is the experience from the Netherlands related to the experience, or maybe to a similar situation in Indonesia? Will it work in the same way? Will it be different? In what way will it be different? And yeah, try to get these questions that you make for yourself also answered. And if you cannot answer it yourself, please ask me. I'm not always immediately answering questions, but I like to help you finding answers. That's, I think, my main objective. Because it's easy to ask and understand answers. And if you have a question, I answer it. And I'm, of course, always willing to do that. But it is, to me, more important that you are able to find the answers yourself. I think someone is using his microphone because I have some background noise. My questions are important, so check what you already know and check if you understand. And in my experience, you learn a lot about yourself and your country by looking at others. And that's why we have organized this event today. Now, I have another Socrates question, but I think because of the time, I will also skip that for a moment. But I'm just asking it to you. Gilbert already gave me some feedback that was difficult to understand because of the loudness, if I'm correct. I try to speak not too fast, but Gilbert, please help me. Do you think everything is clear?
Everything is clear, sir. So far, so good, I think.
Thank you. Yeah. And yeah, help me or ask help from Ms. Rugebrecht if things, because of English, are going too fast or are too difficult. Maybe a last part on myself. This is a disclaimer, not often used in education, but I like to read it loud. I, Hans Hasselt, have over 30 years of experience in teaching, researching, and working in the field of environmental impact and sustainable urban development in many places around the world, like Poland or Hungary or Vietnam or China or Indonesia or South Africa. And so I've been to many places where I was also in many cases involved in always sustainable development projects, but that is related to environmental impact assessment. But I'm not an expert in Indonesia. I've been there a few times, but also as a tourist and only a couple of times in teaching. And I also taught other subjects, for instance, related to water management. So I'm not an expert that only knows everything about AMDAL. I also do not know much about Indonesian development. I've had over 100 students from Indonesia, from all kinds of places in Indonesia, from different islands in the Netherlands for teaching them here. But I'm not an expert in Indonesian development. And I'm also not a lawyer, but originally I'm a chemist, but I consider myself more as a professional. And my master program was obtained in education. So I feel more a professional in education. Now, the last things to everything a little bit in perspective, I'd like to ask you a few things also on the difference between Indonesia and the Netherlands. Most of you will probably know that the Netherlands is a small, this is the country where I live. I live in the eastern part, in a city called Deventer. It's about 100 kilometers from Amsterdam. You might have heard about that. It's in the western part of Europe. And on this map, it looks a little bit like in the middle, but this is a map of the country where Deventer is here and Amsterdam is here, more to the west. The western part is below sea level. It's always an interesting phenomena. In Deventer, it's about 5 meters above sea level, so it's a little bit more safe, and we have a large border with Germany and Belgium. The total length from north to south is about 300 kilometers, and from east to west is something like 150. So the Netherlands is really a small country. So what are the first thoughts when you think about the Netherlands? Please write the answers in the box. So I have to go back to the previous slide on skip this one, and please write some thoughts that you have in the box. You can write short answers. Of course, you can mention something like Amsterdam. What's your first thought? Maybe it's the capital. You can type that, obviously, but that's already something I mentioned. So I like you to explain a few other things that you might know. And you can also say, I don't know anything. This is not a test. This is just practicing a little bit about the comparison between Indonesia and the Netherlands. Because I think differences and similarities matter in understanding the nature of people, but also of environmental impact assessment, the nature of AMDAL. I like this word. Now, I've already answered. Let me see. Ajax football club. Yeah, right. So you're watching football, the Ajax football. Beautiful country. Yeah. I will show a few pictures. I would say it's not as beautiful as Indonesia is, but it's also beautiful. It has beautiful places. Yeah. I will check these answers later and go back now to presentation. What I usually see if I ask this question to foreign students is that they answer tulips. And this is a picture I took myself in one of the tulip fields in the Netherlands. This is in spring. Yeah, it's really beautiful. The Netherlands is quite famous for this, but originally tulips are from Turkey, and we are only very good in agriculture and producing them on specific soils. The Netherlands is often also well known for its wooden shoes. This is particularly for farmers. They have protection if a cow, which is quite a heavy animal, stands on your foot with a normal shoe, like a sport shoe, then it hurts. But this is protection. And of course, there's also this female type of wooden shoe. People like Dutch cheese, Gouda cheese. I'm not sure if you like cheese, but and I know in foreign countries it's often very expensive. This is taken in one of the shops in Deventer that sells cheese, all kinds of cheese. And besides that, the Netherlands is known for its windmills, for pumping, but also for milling. And we are a country with bicycles, so we like to cycle a lot. Not motorbikes. Nowadays, a little bit more electric bikes with a small battery and so powered by this battery. but most of the Netherlands, this is like the former Amsterdam railway station, where you see thousands of bikes parked. And this is one of the things, because we have a flat country, a mild climate, it's nice to cycle. It's seen as very sportive, and of course also very good for the environment, because it doesn't need any petrol, any carbon dioxide emissions. Maybe the most important thing, if you compare Indonesia and the Netherlands, you might have an interesting idea, but it is probably, if I take Indonesia and I represent it on the map of Europe, you see the difference in scale. There is a small country of the Netherlands. This is the Netherlands compared to Indonesia. You see that Indonesia is much, 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 much bigger. So go back and ask you the question on Socrates again. Let me see a few other names, a few other answers. Yeah, windmill country. Thanks. We go back to the next slide. How many times is Indonesia bigger? Do you think it's less than 10 times, between 10 and 20, between 20 and 30, between 30 and 40, or more than 40 times? Size does not always matter, but if you want to put things in perspective, it is important. The Netherlands, of course, Indonesia is well known for its different cultures, the enormous amount of islands. Maluku, of course, is also part of that, but also has many islands, some small, some large. If you want to put things in perspective, the Netherlands has only, I think, five islands. It's a little bit, of course, how you count. We have a little bit more islands, but 5 of them are also populated. And you can take a ferry, and for some it takes 20 minutes, and for others it takes 1.5 hours. But they're all quite close to each other, and that can only be because we have a very small country. Yeah, this is an answer where you can have the right or the wrong answer, obviously. Yeah, 70% knows that it's more than 40 times, and actually Indonesia is 46 times bigger than the Netherlands. Of course, it depends a little bit, of course, on how you count. If you include all the sea around it or not. This is if you look at the maps, you can probably see that Indonesia is really much bigger. And if you look at Maluku and all the islands together, it is probably already bigger than the Netherlands. Some figures. This is perhaps difficult to completely understand, but if you look at the size on top, you already see that Indonesia is much bigger. If you see at the population, it's much bigger. You can calculate then the population density, it's much bigger. If you look at gross national product, then Indonesia has a larger gross national product, but not much larger, at least not compared to the size. If you look at the amount of money in US dollars per capita, then I think there should be there is a kind of mistake. There are some where the dot changed. I will look at that for after this class and improve it before I send the file to you. Indonesia has much more a rural area still compared to the Netherlands. And it also has mountains that we do not have. The highest point in the Netherlands is 300 meters. And if you, for instance, look at the amount of carbon dioxide emissions, then you see also that Indonesia is emitting a little bit more. But compared to the capita, the persons, in the Netherlands, the carbon dioxide emissions are per person much higher. So I will skip for the moment also this question. We already practiced. But if you ask me, what is the biggest challenge for development in the Netherlands, is to find more space for all kinds of combinations. We have designed the country completely for man, and biodiversity has degraded. So that is the biggest challenge for the Netherlands. I'm going to look at the time and see how much time we spent on the introduction. Yeah, already almost 3/4 of an hour. I will continue for briefly with the main part of this lecture. But keep in mind the differences between Indonesia and the Netherlands if we discuss projects from the Netherlands or from Indonesia or from elsewhere. If you look at the history of environmental impact assessment, then it started in 1969 in the US. And that was the first country that had legislation on environmental impact assessment. And then I will show you to the next. The next is Indonesia, which started in 1986. And you see here a bit of dark green, and the Netherlands still light green. We came 1 year later in 1987. And so if you put it in perspective, the history, we have approximately the same period of time in experience with environmental impact assessment legislation. What is environmental impact assessment? And let me start with some definitions from literature. EIA can be defined as a process of collecting information about environmental impacts of a proposed project and consequent relevant decision making. So it's about something that has to be done, a proposed project, and the decision making for this project based on information that is available, but of course, for a proposed project, also a little bit on prediction. And predicting the future is difficult. We all know that. EIA is a different definition, can be defined as a systematic examination of unintended consequences of a development project or program with the view to reduce or mitigate negative impacts and maximize the positive ones. So, for instance, let's take a simple example. If you want to produce drinking water, you can pump good quality fresh water from an aquifer somewhere deep in the ground. And then the intended development is providing drinking water. But before we do so, we need to study what are the unintended consequences. Because if you pump water, you can sell it or you can provide it to people. But what are the unintended consequences? And that is, in this case, for instance, that if you pump out water, then you get less water in the aquifer, less pressure. So you can deplete the resources, and you can even destroy a large part of the country, because most of the country, like the Netherlands and Indonesia, have saline marine environments around the islands that can have adverse effects on the groundwater and even destroy agricultural purposes. And so that requires understanding of systems, but it is to examine unintended consequences. That's maybe the most important thing. Third definition, environmental impact is a tool to aid environmental decision making. So to make it easier to make the right decisions, it's a process that allows public involvement And so that's a very important part, that it's not only the engineers that design things, but that public communities can be involved or will be involved, and can also address positive and negative impacts. And the aim is to determine the best practical course of action. So if you think again a little bit on the drinking water well, for a community where we really have big pumps to produce a lot of drinking water, then maybe the aim is clear, but what the best practical course of action is, that is probably limited to the amount of water that can be produced in a healthy, a sustainable way. And sustainable in this case means that by rain and probably melting of ice, if you have a mountainous area, by rivers that infiltrate fresh water into the ground at a certain amount, you can also produce the same amount of water that is put in the aquifer, you can take out. That would be a good balance, a sustainable balance. So, added in red, the most important things, process of collecting information about environmental impacts of a proposed project, a systematic examination of unintended consequences of a development project to reduce or mitigate negative impacts, a tool to aid environmental decision-making, allows for public involvement, and aim to determine the best practical course of action. These three definitions from literature explain, I think, the idea of environmental impact clearly, but I also made a more simple summary of this. So it's a process of collecting information about environmental impacts of a proposed project, a systematic examination of unintended consequences, a tool to help environmental decision-making, a method for evaluating positive and negative consequences of an intended plan. So environmental impact assessment is quite a lot. It's a little bit on how you look at it. It's a part of legislation, and it's also an instrument to make plans for economic development with social acceptance from communities and people and sufficient ecological protection to develop actually it in a more sustainable way. Now, why do we have environmental impact assessment as a method? Now, I think it might be clear from the previous definitions, but it's to consider new developments carefully before implementation. If you start pumping drinking water and providing it, and you have not really studied it carefully and considered the negative consequences, then you might be surprised by the negative consequences and have destroyed a large part of the country. Now, that would be, I would call it simply stupid. It's to avoid or reduce serious damage, to protect the economic less powerful in society because they are involved, or they can be involved, and to protect the natural resources like mountains, rivers, beaches, species, besides the Homo sapiens species that really takes care of himself, that do not even have a vote. So people, of course, this is EIA is a method used by people as part of a process in legislation. Nowadays, we have also organizations like big companies that have rights, but fortunately, you also see that some countries decided to give rights to rivers. For instance, Ecuador has done that with a river, and also the northern islands of New Zealand has given rights, human rights, to the Wanganui River. That is new, and everyone, I hope, knows that if you have human rights, that should be respected. And so people have human rights, but nowadays also rivers can have human rights. And that gives them a better protection than only with environmental impact assessment. But because not many countries have already adopted this method or this new approach, we still have to do it with environmental impact assessment. I'd like to give you a short break. It's now, and for me, I think in your case, it is 5 o'clock. So I like to continue at 5:05. I need something to drink to be able to speak also for next hour. After the meeting, we will discuss a little bit more on other methods, strategic environmental assessment and social impacts as well. And then I will give a few examples, and we will have explanation on the homework and time for discussion and evaluation. So that will be the next hour. And for now, I like to stop for 5 minutes. So I continue 5:05.
Okay, students, you can give your answer to, feel free to answer a question to Professor Hans Hasselt. Anything with Indonesian or in Bahasa, it's okay. And I can translate to Hans Hasselt, sure. Silakan, bagi Anda yang ingin bertanya tentang apa yang tadi disampaikan, Pak Hans lagi take a break. Di break. Don't mention it, Pak Hans. Jadi Anda mungkin take your time for a while, but kita akan mulai di jam 5:05 waktu Indonesia bagian timur. Jadi apa saja yang mau ditanyakan silakan ya. Akbar, silakan kalau ada pertanyaan terkait dengan apa yang tadi disampaikan oleh Profesor Hans Hasselt. Miriam.
I'm there still, Fancy, but I needed a little bit water to drink. And I'm not sure if the students are used to a short break, but if I speak a lot, I also need to drink a little bit.
Okay, so yes, sure.
This picture was taken during a coffee break in Africa, in Guinea. I thought it was nice to have the mangoes with the coffee, because in the Netherlands that's not quite common to have mangoes.
And if there is, then it's very expensive.
Yes, and not as tasteful as it is like in Africa, but probably also in Indonesia.
Yeah, I know that because I've been there.
They're expensive, and yeah, they're transported for at least I would say 48 hours. Refrigerated, that's usually not good for the taste.
Yeah, I know. Yes.
But the coffee might also have been from Indonesia, I don't know.
Yeah.
Or the tea.
Yeah, it's just common in Indonesia also.
We have 80 participants. That's quite a lot.
Yeah.
83 even. It's 5:05, so I'll continue with the class, with the lecture. So in brief, we discussed, or I explained some definitions and some own explanation on the importance and the method of environmental impact assessment. We also have other instruments to stimulate prosperity. I consider happiness an interesting word, because it's more easy. People can easily ask themselves, am I happy, or are you happy? But it's not so easy to explain how you can become happy. We have difficult words for that. And maybe also kind of ways of looking at it, and it depends on the time of the day, and in social interaction and amounts of money you can spend. At least maybe money is not the most important, but sufficient food and happiness. But there are also many other instruments. And environmental impact assessment is a method to prevent serious damage, or you could say also prevent unhappiness for people. The other instruments that we have, at least that I see, are a constitution and a concept that we call in the Netherlands, and I think also in English, and I hope as students in law you've heard about that, the trias politica, that we have divided roles and rules. And we have a system that we call democracy, with elections and voting and decisions that are based on a majority and governing. So that also makes, and they do not always take the best decisions, but at least there have been a representation and a majority that in many cases also considers things like minorities. And so not always the majority that rules, but they also know that maybe next time, or maybe in a couple of years, they also have to deal with. Thank you, Andre. You can use the pen, indeed. We have laws and regulations, and that is, of course, your part of the society, if you have a degree. And not only the laws and regulations are important, but of course also the enforcement and court of justice. in case of things are not working well. We have administration with policy development. In the Netherlands, I consider urban and regional planning a very strong method, also based on legal instruments, laws, to make sure that not everything can be done by everyone everywhere. We have certain places designated for certain functions. We have public management, so it's not only the governing, but also management. And that is an important instrument. We have education to teach students on what is known. Maybe also at the start on what is right and what is wrong at a very young age. We have financing, where we can give penalties or subsidies for promoting for certain things. We have technology, communication, and many more instruments, but one of them is law, and one of the laws are related to environmental impact assessment. If we want to estimate or a proposed a project, then we also need standards. What is good, what is sufficient, and what is maybe not good. And we have, of course, ethical standards, but also standards for economic development. Maybe if I come back to the simple example of a drinking water supply, in a case where people do not have drinking water, it is obvious that drinking supply is a very important measure, and it is evaluated in a different way than if we already have sufficient drinking water and we want to develop a new well. Standards are difficult because they are depending on societies, on culture, but at least the natural sciences, if you think about health and about pollution or biodiversity, we can exchange information. Water that is polluted in the Netherlands has the same kind of concentrations and same kind of standards as polluted water in Indonesia, although species that live in the water might differ a little bit. But from a chemical point of view, pollution is pollution if it exceeds a certain limit. And so this set of methods and standards together makes it possible to do environmental impact assessments and to stimulate prosperity. I promise that I will briefly explain something also about two other methods. I explained environmental impact assessment, but environmental assessment can be conducted at two levels of decision making. The EIA is decision making on projects such as a dam or a well or a motorway, a power plant, airport or wind park, or many, many more, but they're all individual projects. But there's also strategic environmental assessment, C. It's about decision making on plans and programs, policies, such as a land use plan or an energy plan. And this is called strategic environmental assessment. And I will give an example on the differences later in this presentation this afternoon. But it's obvious that you have two levels. You have the individual projects and you have larger plans, a combination on a little bit bigger and larger scale than only one impact, one project. Besides environmental impact, you also have environmental and social impact assessment. And I think this is maybe the best way to approach environmental impact assessment. It better explains that not only the environmental impacts are important, but also the social impacts. So maybe the best method for projects and plans on a low level, just not the strategic level, is the ASIA, the environmental and social impact assessment. And in many environmental impact assessment methods, the social impacts are also included. but then it's better to also include it in the title. And so what are the effects on society? If you construct a road in the middle of a town, you can look at the environmental impacts, but it's more interesting if it is an urban area to also look at the social impacts. Because if it is a road where cars drive, then it becomes difficult for children to play. And you can see a better road as a kind of progress in economic development, but you can also see it as a social impact on people's life. It creates noise, it creates unsafe situations. It makes it difficult for young children or for elderly people, perhaps to cross the road. So it also has all kinds of social impacts, and they have to be studied as well to predict and mitigate maybe the adverse effects. To predict, yeah. Let me give an example. An example from Europe. In Europe, we have a large amount of countries, 26, and each country used to have its own legislation. But since the European Union, we also have now a legislation at the highest level, and that also includes, of course, development of policies. And to make Europe a little bit more collaborative, that we can easily cross borders, and not only for recreational purposes, but also for economic purposes. So, for instance, that Germans and the Netherlands and Dutch people can work together. There are all kinds of subsidies. And one of the subsidies is for establishing border crossing industrial areas. Areas that are really on the border. So in this case, the Dutch and German border. And so there is an entrance on the German side, and there's an entrance and of course exit on the Dutch side. And the industries that are stimulated to settle in this industrial area get a little bit subsidy, because the idea is that not only German people work there and not only Dutch people work there, but that it's a combination. So I hope you can understand a little bit. For becoming a European Union, it's also important that people work together. There was a location selected for the industrial area on the German-Dutch border, and there was an EIA required. And the results of this environmental impact assessment for the industrial area on this border were governments on all kinds of levels were very happy, because it stimulates work. This stimulates economic development. It creates jobs for communities, from people in the communities, and it creates collaboration between people that live on the German side and on the Dutch side. So governments, municipalities, provinces, states, on all levels of government, everyone was very happy with this approach. Entrepreneurs, like the industrial entrepreneurs that wanted to settle in this industrial area, were very happy, because there are always entrepreneurs that like to start a business, and it makes it much more easy if you can start this business on this border crossing site, because you have already approval from German and Dutch governments. So it makes import and export much more easy, and you get even money for settling, because there was this subsidy from the European Union. So also entrepreneurs were very happy. But then on this area, this indigenous species, it's called hamster. You might know it as a pet. In some countries it's used as a pet. I included the picture. This species was having its habitat on this area, and because of the Habitat Directive in Europe, indigenous species are well protected, and it makes it impossible to start a business. So from, let's say, human perspective, people entrepreneurs, government, everyone was happy to establish this industrial area, but because of this hamster, and in total there were about, I think, 150 different animals, so very small population, but indigenous and rare, it was not allowed. And this is the power, I would say, of environmental impact assessment, because it does not only look at the economic situation, it doesn't only look at the social impact, like creating jobs and maybe better economic development for communities in the area, but it also includes rights of, in this case, a hamster, a species, to be protected by government, by law, for living in this area. And of course, then you can think about mitigating measures, and maybe we can replace the hamster population and put it elsewhere. That is a clear thought. Or maybe we can establish an industrial area that is going well in collaboration with the hamster species, that their living environment is not destroyed, but both were impossible. So that meant simply the whole project was cancelled. Let me give you, let me ask you the question, if this idea of environmental impact with this example is made clear, or do you have questions about this? Okay. If there are no questions, if there are questions, please raise your hand, put something in the chat. Yeah, Gilbert, thank you. I see your hands. Is that a new hand or a...
Yes, there is a new hand. Mark, you want to...
Oh yeah, Mark, sorry.
Question for Hans, please.
I
think he's typing something in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I can unmute myself before.
Okay.
So it is really the project, the whole project is cancelled.
Everything is cancelled. Yeah.
The habitat of hamster will be destroyed and the whole project is cancelled.
Because of the fact that if we would build this industrial area, the hamster species will be destroyed. The whole project is cancelled. Yeah.
I was just like, it was really stunned when I heard that, just because the habitat of hamster will be destroyed, and but the government on the two sides and different levels are approved and happy, and the other side entrepreneurs like to invest, but just because the habitat of hamster will be destroyed, then the EIA required to make the project cancelled. I just like, oh
yeah,
it's like a big thing.
Because in law it is clearly stated that certain species are protected, and in this case it's a hamster, and you might have seen a hamster. I'm not sure on a picture, or maybe you have even in the Netherlands, many children used to have a hamster, not this one, but more a Russian one that is not so rare, as a pet. And they're very they're nocturnal animals, so they live at night. You hardly see them, but it's a nice animal. But we even have stopped similar projects because of a snail, or you could say, where's the limit? In the European legislation, we do not have legislation for mosquitoes, because we kill them if we see them, because we don't like mosquitoes. But if there would be legislation about protection of mosquitoes, even a mosquito could stop a project like this. I'm not sure if you're fond of mosquitoes. No, you're muted, so...
Yeah, thank you, sir. I just... Why, if the hamster habitat will be destroyed, then why did not make the allocation to other habitat?
Yeah, it's a good question. That is, we have the habitat of the hamster is not very large. It's maybe about 2 kilometers in size, in a kind of circle. So the fact is, why didn't we change the industrial area for 2 kilometers to the north or to the south or something like that? That was simply impossible. Because there was a village, there was other industrial area that was not on both sides. There was a hilly area that was not well. And so this was also maybe a little bit bad luck. That in this location, there was not an alternative, a little bit more north or south. East was possible, but then it was not on the border anymore. West was possible, but then it was also not on the border anymore. And that was actually the main purpose, to create it on the border. So north and south were not possible. Yeah, then it stopped. Yeah. I have another example. If you have questions, feel free. So, like I said at the start, I think that sustainable development, I hope you've heard about it, is important. And sustainable development is not about ecological protection. It's not about economic development. It's not about social acceptability or good living standards for people. It's the combination of all three. And that is also something that environmental impact assessment, and particularly environmental and social impact assessment, like to establish, to find this good solution in a balance between what people need, and part of it, what they need is food, and other things that they need is money, so jobs, and what the planet needs. And this in the middle, it is called sustainability, and that is what environmental impact actually tries to achieve. I don't like the word of profit because it has a bit negative meaning. So in many cases, this profit is changed to prosperity, which is a little bit more friendly. In simple, it's like this. And this is the society. These are people, and people are depending for breathing from oxygen, for instance, a tree. And we produce from oxygen carbon dioxide, and trees are depending for growing for carbon dioxide. We also need food, and we can eat rice, but rice doesn't grow naturally. It requires labor. So the community is depending on its environment, and environment includes urban areas, it includes agricultural areas, industrial areas, maybe many more. But we have to find this balance between the environment and human use of this environment and all kinds of functions for humans. So, if you want to do an environmental impact assessment, there are a few steps, and these are put in law. And I'm going to explain them more detailed next week. But for now, I think it is important to understand the major steps. One of them is the environmental screening. That's the part where you look at what kind of information is available on the project, but also on protection measures, on alternatives. Then you do the environmental scoping, and that's what I'm going to elaborate a little bit on now and further next week. Then there's the execution of the environmental impact assessment based on the screening and scoping. And of course, there's also the public participation, where societies, people that are affected or have some kind of effect of the impact, can also have a say or even discuss alternatives or mitigating measures. Now, so most of it will be discussed next week in detail, again with an example, but now I will give another example on an environmental impact assessment of a railroad between Rotterdam in the Netherlands and Germany, Düsseldorf. These areas, this is the harbor area. Rotterdam is besides the harbor of Shanghai, one of the biggest harbors in the world. This used to be the Ruhr. This is actually the Ruhr area in Germany, one of the biggest industrial areas in the world. So you can imagine that all things that come from China and from Indonesia and from Asia end up in Rotterdam, but have to be transported to the Ruhr area. This can be iron, this can be oil, this can be computers, can be anything, but it requires transportation. The Dutch government decided to construct a railroad line, and it's called Betuwe Route Line, because this is the area that is called Betuwe, and it has lots of fruit trees that originally are there for over hundreds of years. People in this area grow fruit, apples, pears, cherries, that kind of fruits. The idea, I think, is simple: construct a railroad, and this is a plan. This is a project, so it requires environmental impact assessment. It's a big plan because it has all kinds of parts. In total length, it's 160 kilometers, and it should be freight. So there's only transportation of cargo and not much, actually no people. We also have railroads for that, but this is particularly only for cargo. So the question, and then I'm going back to the questionnaire. I will skip a few questions. This one: what kind of impact do you expect? This is the scoping part of the environmental impact assessment. What kind of impact do you expect? And this is actually also a similar question for the homework next week, but then I have different impacts to study, different projects. Do you have any idea what kind of impacts a railroad can have on the society, on the environment? Might be difficult. If this is a physical class, then I would say discuss this with your neighbor. Maybe you use chat for or WhatsApp for exchange information with your fellow students if you're not in the same room. These are things that can easily be discussed. Is it difficult for you to if it is too difficult, I go back to the slides and give you my idea on this. You can also raise hand or put things in the chat. Or maybe if I go too fast, then also please tell me so. What kind of impacts do you expect? I was expecting that you were expecting things like land degradation. If you have a meadow area where there are cows growing, eating the grass, producing milk, then part of this land is destroyed because the railroad needs some space. That's a very simple impact. And you could say maybe it's not too much space. How much does a railroad needs? Depends, of course, a little bit on the construction, if you make it one way or two ways. But of course, there's always land degradation because the current function cannot be continued because we need space for the railroad. Many people think that a railroad in a meadow area is not very nice. So the landscape itself, so not only the land use, but also the landscape is destroyed. There are species living sometimes in this area. Not only cows are grazing, but some parts are also natural areas. So we reduce the size, and we also divide ecosystems. And you can imagine that just like the road in a small village, it separates two parts of an area, an ecosystem. And so if you have, let's say, a male hamster and a female hamster, and they are separated between by a railroad, then yeah, they will not meet, and the whole population will extinct. People that live near a railroad sometimes feel vibrations. If a heavy train passes by, then you can feel a kind of vibration in the house, which is not nice. If you live in a house and you're just watching television or whatever, YouTube, and you feel vibrations from a train, it's not nice. And there are all kinds of effects, but most of them are negative. That's why I added this minus in front. But some of them are also positive. And because of the railroad, we do not have that many trucks on the streets. And trucks produce air pollution, and trains also produce air pollution, but on a concentration. These trains are electrified trains, so we need gas to produce electricity, but this is much more clean than all the trucks we need. And noise is a little bit discussable because trucks produce noise, railroads also, and that's something that is not clear what is more and what is less. Okay, let's go to now. The next question is, what other kinds of impacts do you expect? And this is a question more for social impacts or other kinds of impacts. These were the environmental impacts, but you can also have social impacts. And this is like a farmhouse. And you can imagine if this is a farmhouse in the Netherlands and there will be built a railroad in front of it. Now, that's not very nice. And so there's social impact as well, because people do not like a railroad in front of their house. These are fruit trees that are growing in this area a lot. And these are not too old, but they are a little bit old. They're high, and because modern trees are very small, so you can easily pick fruit from the trees. But here you need something like a ladder. And that is old-fashioned, but also considered as cultural heritage, and therefore also important. And if a railroad is constructed in the middle of this, it also destroys this cultural heritage. It's not only landscape, but it's also the landscape that is considered cultural heritage. What other impact do you expect? I would expect land division. And the farmer might need to cross the railroad, which is not always possible. So if he wants to go from one part of his farmland to the other part of the farmland, he's already losing farmland because of the construction, but he also needs to make detours to go to his own area. Communities can be divided. There can be a part on one side and a part on the other side. And then, of course, we can construct a bridge or a tunnel, but that's expensive. And it is also not always nice to use a tunnel. Especially women in the dark don't like to use a tunnel. So it creates effects on societies that are not intended and therefore have to be studied in an environmental and social impact assessment. There's of course the cost for construction, maintenance and operation that is an effect. We have reduced value of real estate. Imagine the farmer that has this railroad constructed in front of his house. It makes it much more difficult for him to sell his house for a good price. And so there's reduced value of real estate. There's reduced safety for the community because there's a freight train, perhaps also with toxic substances passing by their village. And so there are all kinds of impacts that you have to list in the scoping of this project to be studied later on. So you can read the list. There are also positive effects, like carbon dioxide reduction, less trucks reduction, jobs created by construction, by maintenance, by operation. So it's not only bad, but we have to find a good balance. Now, let me just tell you the results. And so I would like you to practice later on with the scoping. and therefore I made a small homework assignment. But this is the result of the environmental impact assessment of the freight railroad in the Netherlands between the German harbor and the German Ruhr area. The result was that the construction started, actually the plans were made in the 90s, 1996. And it took, because of the environmental impact assessment procedure, about almost 10 years to really start constructing. So the construction started in 2003 and then took another 10 years for the whole Dutch part. And so the total length of the railroad was 160 kilometers, but the part is in Germany, and the Dutch part was 108 kilometers and took 10 years to construct and 10 years in advance to plan. So it took 20 years. The German part, 52 kilometers, is expected to be finished in 2022. And so we finished the railroad in 2013, but the Germans will finish it next year. So that means it's not a good working railroad line at the moment, because the German part is not finished. In the German part, it still runs, had a train run on the former old parts. The result of this environmental impact assessment was that we invested a lot of money. I included the price, and so it is 47,000 million euros. So in fact, in English, it's called 47 trillion euros, which is excluding VAT. The constructing companies and all those have also to pay VAT. While the expected cost in 1995, at the start of the planning, was 1.1 trillion euro. So in total, the costs were 47, maybe you could say 40 times more than it was expected. Now, I'm not sure if you buy, if you sometimes buy things like a cell phone, and you think, okay, I can afford to buy a cell phone of 1 trillion euro, and you end up with a cell phone of 47 trillion euro, then something went wrong completely. This is, you can maybe exceed it a few million euro, because it's not always easy, and this is over 10 years time, so it's not easy to predict. But 47 times exceeding the limit, that's not a good. So in the end, it is the most expensive piece of infrastructure ever built in the Netherlands. And that is because we needed many bridges, many tunnels, not only for humans, but also for species, for natural areas. And so the calculated capacity of trains is 48,000 trains a year. And because the fact that the German part is still not finished, we only have 24,000, 50%. So in fact, the Dutch and German society paid a large amount of money, really large amount, for 50% of what was expected. This is disappointing. So again, you can see that this is partly in Dutch. It's not so important. I will explain it briefly. This is the number of rupiah on top. I cannot even pronounce that correctly, but it's a huge amount. I hope you understand. 47 trillion euro. It's really huge. This is the why it became so. It is in Dutch, but every part is either a crossing for a bridge, for a road, a railroad, or a waterway, a canal, river. So of course, bridges and tunnels are very expensive, and that's why we ended up so with such a large amount. This is how it looks like. And you see here a railroad. Here you see the train, and you see also a bridge that was constructed here because there used to be a road, and because of the railroad, now needs a bridge, and bridges and tunnels are very expensive. This is the size. You see that this is the farmland. It has now canals on both sides and expensive railroad. And this is partly a tunnel. So it's also excavated because people don't like to see the railroad. In some places it is below ground level, so there is a minor impact in the landscape. But there's also, of course, enormous amount of construction cost if you excavate soil and construct tunnels. This is noise barriers, because in areas where people live, they don't like to hear the train. So we created noise barriers, and these noise barriers are, of course, also expensive, and they're also ugly, not very nice. Zevenaar is a village, and they were not very enthusiastic about the construction of the railroad through the middle of their village. And then they decided we can better collaborate with the national government that is constructing this plan, because we know there's a lot of money available. And if we are explaining that we are against this, then we will have a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of legal court facts, a lot of time that is flowing away. We better have another approach and try to make it as best as possible, so we get lots of money for constructing a tunnel which has a minor impact instead of a normal railroad. That could be a smart solution if you know that in the end the government will nevertheless construct it, then use the approach to make it in a good way. So a little bit on the results to be continued. Now you've seen some pictures. Trains run between Germany and the Netherlands because of trucks, and that is an improvement, you could say. There's protection of people with noise barriers and tunnels. We have a safe railroad constructed with fences so people cannot easily get accidents. We have sprinkler systems on the railroad track. We have video control. People are watching the trains in case of calamities. All, of course, very expensive. We have prevention of intersections with underground constructions, not only for humans to have like tunnels, but also ecoducts for animals to cross this railroad. We have fauna tunnels for ecosystems. We have compensation in space and in money. We have reduced carbon dioxide and reduced traffic, and also a little bit in general traffic. And this is how a fauna tunnel looks like. It's not at the railroad, but at a normal road. Animals can cross this road with the tunnel instead of being run over on the truck itself. And this is a measure, a mitigating measure. So one of the lessons of this route is, I have 15 minutes, so I speed up a little bit. We have EIA procedures and processes that are slow, but work well. In the end, we have now a railroad that is safe, that has mitigating measures with tunnels, with sufficient crossings. The decision-making is a weak point. And this is because the Minister of Infrastructure decided in the 90s that we would make this railroad. Many people were against it because it's not a good solution, according to them. But it was once decided, and then the government is not going to stop anymore, and it should be continued. We have technology and a lot of money that reduced many of the impacts, many of the negative effects. With money, also people that have reduction of their property can be compensated, and we have not collaborated well with the Germans, with other stakeholders. The Germans will finish their part of the railroad next year, so it's still not running efficiently for over 10 years. So the Beaterer route, instead of having an environmental impact assessment like it was, should have had a strategic environmental assessment. And let me show you why. This is again the same map. This is the Ruhr area in Germany. This is the harbor area in Rotterdam. And between Rotterdam and the Ruhr area is already this natural river flowing. It's coming from Switzerland all the way up north and goes to the sea. This is the river we call Rhine. And instead of looking to an environmental impact assessment study for a railroad, it better should have been a strategic assessment on how to transport goods from Rotterdam to the Ruhr area. Yeah, so strategic assessment would have included that the trucks could have been carried all the freight, that the railroad could have carried the cargo, that we could have planes for freight transportation, and that we could have navigation ships for. And on a strategic level, it would have been much smarter to decide what would be the best alternative: roads for trucks, railroads for trains, airports for planes, or the existing river. And the sea, this started in the 1990s, so about 25 years ago. And then we did an environmental impact assessment, but later on, it was commonly agreed that a strategic environmental assessment would have been much more important, because then we could have discussed these different alternatives, and the clear favor was for navigation. Main infrastructure, the river, was already present, so we don't need to construct new things. It is originally present, and ships are much more efficient than trains. Trains are more efficient than trucks and planes, but ships are even more important. So this is how a container vessel looks like, and you can easily see that it contains much more containers than a truck, and it should be a very long train to transport all the same amount of containers. This is another one. You can see that these are expensive ships, of course, but this is much more easy. The infrastructure is already there. So this was my explanation on why, what's the difference between strategic environmental assessment and environmental impact assessment. So on a plan with alternatives, on a project with alternatives. And I'm wondering if there are any questions.
Ya, adakah yang ingin bertanya?
Because I thought it was interesting, and so if there are any questions, please feel free speak in Bahasa with Ms. Rugbrecht. Type in the chat.
Ya, Anda boleh bertanya di room chat dengan bahasa Indonesia saja terkait dengan apa yang
Agnes.
disampaikan. Oke, Agnes, please.
Okay, thank you. I'm still a bit confused on the difference between the SEA and the EIA, because I think in Indonesia we're only familiar with AMDAL, which I guess it's only the EIA if we translate it or we compare it. So maybe, I'm not sure for the other people, but I'm just wondering, after explanation on the freight train track from Rotterdam to Germany, just how, like, I understand your explanation how if using SCA, how the alternatives would have changed the impact of it, but how would, like, what are the different starting points for EIA and SCA? Because in my head, I imagine that an EIA would be a part of the SCA, and what parameters or what signals do you need to like differentiate between a project and like a major
plan
infrastructure? Like, yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I think I clearly understand your question. This example of this railroad actually showed us, the Dutch society, you could say, that an environmental impact assessment can be a very strong instrument to protect, but that we also need on a more strategic level a similar instrument for first decision making. So if you decide on a railroad and start immediately on looking at the positive and negative impacts, then you already have probably missed the biggest opportunity on a strategic level to decide, is this a good way? And if the purpose is to transport containers from A to B, then you should not only do an impact assessment on railroads, but you should do a strategic assessment on all kinds of ways of container transportation. So, in fact, I would recommend that if it is a small project, like for instance, the improvement of an existing road, that it becomes a little bit bigger, then you can do, for instance, immediately an environmental impact assessment on this. If you want to construct a new hotel on a beach, you probably can do an environmental impact assessment on this, but perhaps already it is more interesting to do a strategic assessment first on where this hotel should be. And maybe not on, because there might be several beaches available. And then if the idea is to create a hotel, that could be fine, but usually the hotel is a way of making money, and maybe it's not the best approach. So I would always suggest, first think strategically, what are alternatives before you start with an environmental impact assessment on the chosen project. I would like, because, yeah, I do not like to extend your class too much. I'm not sure if there are any other questions. I do have time available. I don't have anything else planned for the next half hour. So,
do you mind if I?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So, do you think it is within? Because obviously the train track from Rotterdam to Germany was a government project. So do you think there is a limit on private projects and how and who is responsible on them in the name of like public prosperity, or like in the name of the good of the public? Since you said, because, or do you think that the government should be involved in every private project? And SCA should be a part of that, because I remember reading about this big interstate road in Hawaii that I think had the same time span as the train track that you just explained. However, in the end, there were a lot of also unhappy stakeholders like the indigenous communities of Hawaii that in the end didn't even want to use the train track because they thought it was taboo or like negative towards their sacred communities. So I'm just wondering if in the end, this perspective on SCA versus EIA and how there has to be a strategic look around on or strategic alternatives, does that mean that the government will have to have a bigger intervention in private projects?
It's a very good question and also a very difficult one, because it deals a little bit also with, I would say, decision making in general. In a democracy like in the Netherlands, I like to use this country not because it's well organized, but it's the best one I know. after elections, there is a government formed, and they are responsible for the decision making, and it depends a lot on what kind of decisions they make. So at the moment we have a liberal government that is very much in favor of all kinds of plans, liberal plans for economic development. And it only lasts for 4 years, and then we can decide for a new government. But within this time frame, they have a kind of majority and decide on what is more important, and that is a political choice. And so I was talking about the balance between, for instance, rights of indigenous people compared to economic development. And I usually do not agree with the decisions my government makes in this, but I'm fortunate that we have a government that makes decisions, because otherwise it would be even worse, I guess. And I think, in my opinion, the rights of indigenous people should be much more important than constructing a road. But of course, there's a price for everyone, everything. There could be an alternative, a detour road that is not crossing through this indigenous people's country. If that is a good alternative, because it takes 5 minutes more, then I would say choose for the alternative. But if it takes 12 hours more, yeah, then it becomes difficult. If it takes much more money, then there's also a limit to that, because the money from the government is my money, tax money, your money. The government does not have money. We supply them with our money. So I hope I did answer it a little bit. It is not if you look at history, and that's why I explained this example, because you can learn from it and improve decision making, and improve strategic assessments, and improve environmental impact assessments. From a project point of view, this railroad was well constructed. It was much more expensive than expected, and actually, but on a strategic level, it completely failed, and that actually meant that the decision making failed. But we were not aware of the strategic opportunities. Of course, we were aware of this, but it was not put in legislation at the time, so it was not required. Yeah. Other questions? If you allow me, then I have, we're already exceeding the time, but I was wondering if you could make a kind of scoping. And so what are impacts on two cases? One, it could be a landfill on an island, for instance, the island you live on. Suppose there will be a new landfill constructed. What will be the impacts? And so you don't have to tell me that it's not nice to have a new landfill, but what could be the impacts? And please consider them, and you can do that together. And another one is if there would be a port constructed for tourism on an island. Could be your island, could be any island. Of course, it depends a little bit on where. So I would ask help from Ms. Rugebrecht to form groups. Okay. And perhaps also send me something in advance for next week. So the scoping of the project actually means that, okay, this is a landfill. These are pictures I took on Ambon 10 years ago. So you imagine a little bit like how it is to have landfill. You might be familiar with this one, or and this is the case for the second case, the port for cruise vessels. This is a large cruise vessel. This is a large cruise vessel. And if you look, for instance, what the impact is in Venice, this is a picture taken in Venice, Italy. It's huge. This is only aesthetical, but of course, imagine what impact, what social impact does it have, what environmental impact does it have, and try to make a list of the impacts, positive ones, negative ones, consider alternatives, that could be interesting. If it is interesting and we have large group of students, then there's also a third case. If it's interesting, it could be a solar plant, a solar power plant. And scoping actually means make a list of impacts, environmental, social, economical. Think a little bit about phasing, design and plan, construct, operate, phasing out, participation. If phasing out is easy, let's say we need this landfill for 50 years and afterwards we don't need it anymore, then it becomes important that phasing out also means that after 50 years nothing is visible anymore. Think about things like participation. So we can start next week with discussing your ideas on environmental impact assessment, perhaps also on strategic impact assessment, but these are small projects, a landfill and a port. Now this is something like help. It's not homework, it should be not too complicated. I don't want you to spend many hours on this, but perhaps try to discuss these things as a group. If you have a group of 6 and everyone has 2 impacts, then we already have a long list. So for next week, I intend to discuss the scoping lists. I like to elaborate more on the relevant steps for EIA, like the 4 steps I showed you briefly today. I like to share some other projects with environmental impact assessment, for instance, a big harbor in Turkey, and I have to decide on the second one. And I like you to help in the decision making to find this balance with a method called multi-criteria analysis. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but I like to explain it and like to show you how it can help in decision making to find this balance between economic prosperity, ecologically viability, and social acceptability. Thank you for your attention. See, I will correct one of the mistakes in the presentation and then send it to you.
Yes.
So you can share it with the students.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much, Professor Hans. And now we are with Pak Arman Anwar also, Pak Hans. He's one of our team teaching also. Pak Arman, say hello to Miss Professor Hans. Professor Hans, this is Dr. Arman Anwar.
Hello, nice to meet you. I think he's still muted.
Hello, Prof. Hans. Nice to meet you.
Hello, nice to meet you. Good to see you in front of many books.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
He reads many books. Professor already done.
Yeah. I love reading books.
But too much reading make a headache.
I know that this is something that distinguishes generations.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. Maybe our time is up. And jangan lupa bahwa Anda punya tugas minggu depan. Hari ini Pak Hans Hasselt menerangkan banyak sekali AMDAL yang berhubungan dengan AMDAL di luar negeri. Sedangkan ada beberapa perbedaan antara AMDAL di luar negeri dan AMDAL di dalam negeri. Jadi Anda ambil semua yang tadi sudah disampaikan. Terima kasih untuk para mahasiswa yang sudah bertanya, Gilbert, Agnes, dan mungkin minggu depan semuanya boleh bertanya kepada Prof. Hans, meskipun dalam bahasa Indonesia nanti ditranslate ke dalam bahasa Inggris. Ya, jangan lupa siapkan pertanyaan. Setelah ini nanti saya akan membagi grup bagi Anda karena ada beberapa tugas homework. You have to do that homework in a group. Jadi jangan jangan memberikan jawaban yang terlalu susah-susah dan banyak, tapi simple saja dan jelas. Karena beliau juga tidak ingin memeriksa berbagai macam pekerjaan rumah dengan model yang terlalu berbelit-belit. Jadi to the point saja, supaya beliau bisa. So, thank you so much for Professor Hans, also for Pak Arman Anwar, and also for all the students. See you next week.
Yes, and please, I would like to have some feedback from you and from the students.
Yeah.
And perhaps also on the program for next week.
Okay. See.
Yeah. I hope the time will be similar.
Yes.
Same time. Yeah.
Same.
Okay.
Same time. Also in the same day.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hans. See you next week. Terima kasih semuanya, Pak Arman. Terima kasih. Mungkin kita akan bertemu lagi. Jangan lupa setelah ini ketua kelas tolong bagi kelompok, make a group to finish your homework. Yang tadi sudah Pak Hans sampaikan apa yang harus Anda kerjakan. Nanti saya kirimkan yang tadi saya sudah screenshot juga buat Anda supaya dilihat tugas-tugasnya apa saja. Thank you so much and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Pak Arman, terima kasih. Gilbert.
Terima kasih, fans.
Ya, Agnes, terima kasih. Jangan lupa minggu depan tolong Anda buat pertanyaan supaya bisa bertanya kepada Pak Hans Hasselt. Lalu mungkin juga memberikan feedback tentang apa yang tadi telah disampaikan atau telah diajarkan oleh Prof. Hans. Supaya beliau tahu kira-kira Anda paham tidak apa yang tadi disampaikan. Ya. Mungkin itu saja. Gilbert nanti tolong bantu teman-teman ya, Gil.
Iya, Ibu.
Oke. Akbar jangan lupa juga ya.
Iya, Ibu.
Oke. Terima kasih Pak Arman.
Baik, terima kasih juga Ibu Fancy, saudara-saudara semuanya. Terima kasih atas partisipasi dalam kuliah ini. Saya memberikan apresiasi yang tinggi kepada saudara-saudara semuanya. Tetap semangat ya, sampai kuliah kita selesai.
Siap.
Baik, Pak.
Oke. Terima kasih, Pak.
Baik, saya mohon izin ya, Liv.
Ya, saya juga izin ya.
Ibu. Terima kasih, Bu. Terima kasih, Pak.
Selamat sore semuanya.
Ya, makasih Pak. Selamat sore. Terima kasih, Bu.
Ya.
Bu.
Terima kasih, Bu.
Isro jangan lupa minggu depan Anda bertanya.